Hi everyone, welcome to my PowerPoint lecture on thesis statements. So, thesis statements are super helpful and important for getting you to think about how to introduce your argument in a succinct and concise way. My philosophy is that thesis statements occur at the end of your introduction, so that they're a cumulative point, that they wrap everything up, and that they bring everything together and introduce the parameters of your argument. So, first let's take an overview of the thesis statement and take a look here. So, point number one, they are important statements that come at the end of your introduction. As I said before, typically from my classes, they are the last two sentences of your introduction. I kind of look at them as a Goldilocks situation. 3 sentences is too many, 1 sentence is too few. So 2 sentences is just right as you get all the components in. They present your argument to the reader in a clear and succinct way. They can also often transition with therefore. And I think it's really important to think about, I tell a lot of my students to earn the therefore, because if you're using that transition, then you have peppered in enough keywords and points in your introduction to follow up with that cumulative therefore, comma, and then your thesis statement, and it makes sense. So, the keywords of your thesis statement should be peppered throughout the introduction before it, so as to introduce the context and parameters of your argument. So you may be asking yourself now, what are the 3 components of the thesis statement, or what are the components of the thesis statement? To which I would answer the what, the how, and the why. So these are the 3 components that are peppered in. Typically the what and how appear in the first sentence of the thesis statement, while the second sentence focuses on the why. And as you start to master this, particularly the thesis statement, right, in the structure, then you can start to deviate and play around with this. For instance, in our shorter papers that are 2 to 3 pages or a 5-page paper, you're going to find typically a 2-sentence thesis statement that's succinct at the end of your introduction. However, for a larger research paper, or something that focuses on research methods, maybe it's anywhere between 15 and 25 pages, you might have a whole paragraph that focuses on the components of the thesis statement. So first, let's take a look at the what. So, the what is the claim that you're making, the assertion, the argument. It is what you've noticed about a text or topic that others may have missed. It is also the argumentative topic of your paper. So a couple examples here. You might, for instance, argue that a novel, a text is feminist for the following reasons. Or for perhaps looking at Supreme Court cases, you might think about the way in which the Supreme Court cases Dred Scott versus Sandford and Korematsu versus the US both discriminate against Americans of color in the following ways. So again, in a really succinct way of thinking about it, the what is your argument. It is not just your observations. It's not just the topic. It is not a passive construction. It is the argument and topic of your paper, but it presents some sort of argument to which your reader could agree or disagree. Our goal here is not to please everyone, but to create a paper that takes a strong, informed, and passionate stance about an issue. Okay, secondly, following the what, you have the how. And the how, in short, is your method, right? It's your methodology, it's your method of evaluation. How will you prove your point? What does your evidence throughout your paper have in common? Try to categorize it. Think about all the evidence you brought in and see if you could put them in succinct categories. If your evidence is all over the place, that is your quotation, your data, then you might want to narrow it down to something that is provable in a 2 to 3 page paper, or a 5 to 7 page paper, or even a 6 to 10 page paper, right? Like you have to think about the scale of your paper and what you're trying to prove and how that evidence matches it. This is the lens in which you are using to analyze the text, right? So thinking about the way in which you might focus on folklore, for instance, in the Joy Luck Club, and you might use these kinds of constructions and the examples by analyzing a Hegelian reading of the master-slave dialectic in Frankenstein. This is something you might want to think about here. So in terms of thesis statements, the how is really important for 2 reasons. One, it could be your methodology from close reading, or in terms of close reading, your novel, your text, thinking about the language, thinking about your point of entry into a text. It can also include your critical lens, right? In thinking about, for instance, applying a Marxist reading or a Hegelian reading or something along those lines. And also on this slide, of course, there are a couple little typos there that I took care of, so you might want to draw your attention to it. But it's important to think about what is your method. And literary studies, compositional studies, absolutely includes method, just like you would in any other class. In fact, you could use this methodology to think about how are we using this in biology, how are we using this in the social sciences and psychology. You absolutely can have a what, how, and why in your thesis statement. So this brings us to our last point and our last component of the thesis statement, the why. So the why is the last part of your thesis, which states why your thesis is important and why it is of interest to the reader. It states the significance, the why of your observations made in the what and the how sections. It also answers the questions, so what? And why do my arguments matter? This is really important to think about because a lot of students take time to point out, some sort of issue, to make an argument, and they prove it, but they never tell us why it matters. Why does it matter? Why should we know that there is this folklore in the Joy Luck Club, or that, Frankenstein can use a Hegelian reading in order to do what? Why is this important? So this is the part that's often left out of student papers, but it is vital to your argument. You have to tell us why this matters, why we should think about it. You can even tell us who cares or who should care in terms of the argument you're making. So try using the phrase, this is significant because, to start off the second sentence of the thesis statement. Again, when you master this and get this down, you don't need to be tied to this is significant because. But if you're just starting out and you're a novice and you're trying to get a handle on what this is and what the thesis statement is, then I would absolutely start out with that because it gets you to answer the question, well, why does this matter? This is significant for the following reasons. Alternatively, you could also use, in so doing, the author critiques or undermines or reinforces or supports, right? Not all these things at once, but you could think about it from the position of the author. The author critiques these issues for the following reasons, or the text undermines these issues or reinforces, right? So these are just some examples and some paradigms that you can use to establish your why. One such example discusses the following. This is significant because the author undermines patriarchal expectations of women's docility via feminist protagonist who does the following. So it's important to think about. So take a few moments here. In the next thesis statement example, try to pick out the what, how, and why. And I would invite you to pause this slideshow so that you can kind of point out, all right, where do I see the how? Where do I see the what? Where do I see the why? And after you've done that, we can go over it so that you can see what the answers are and how the components break down here in this example. So, by using the motif of motherhood and birthing imagery in Frankenstein, Shelley is able to autobiographically graft her mother-child relationship onto Victor and his creature as evident in the conflict Victor experiences when he determines the mortality of the creature. So we'll just kind of take it from there and think about it. So you've got the how actually in the first part. You may have wanted to say the what in terms of the order that it's found in, but here actually in what's highlighted in green, this is the actual how, right? Your methodology. It's the motif of motherhood and the birthing imagery in this novel, Frankenstein. And what I would absolutely recommend is reintroducing and restating your author as well as the text or the article or something along those lines. In the introduction and the thesis statement, right? You may have already introduced it in the intro, but let's just pretend that your thesis statement was picked out of the introduction, like abstracted in some way. And we'd want to know what text we're thinking about and what's happening here in this instance. Okay, so you have this in terms of, Frankenstein's argument in terms of the how. Now when you're moving on in terms of the next component, if you answer the blue as the what, you're absolutely correct, right? So this is the argument. To autobiographically graft her mother-child relationship onto Victor and his creature as evident in the conflict that Victor experiences, right? And it goes on. So taking an autobiographical argument and stance for Frankenstein is something that's not typically done, and it would be a rogue argument here, and it would be really interesting, and it's not what everybody sees. Finally, moving on to the last part. This is significant because Shelley's own life experiences of failed motherhood in relationship to her own mother and children mirror Victor's failure as a parent to the creature. And again, this thesis statement may not make sense to you because you may or may not have read Frankenstein, which I really recommend, and it's super interesting. But it's an interesting take on the thesis statement. And of course, if you answer that this is the why, then you're absolutely correct. We have the phrasing, this is significant because. We've got the author's involvement here, the stance they're taking. If you're not comfortable with that, you can always talk about it in terms of the text and what the text is doing, but it's super interesting to see this. Ultimately, when you get the structure down and you're familiar with it, you could look at any thesis statement and understand the structure, even if you don't understand the argument or the parameters or the context fully. So take a moment in looking at this second example. And again, we're looking at a context coming from literary studies, and try to break down the what, how, and why. Again, I invite you to pause this PowerPoint slideshow in order to do so. Okay, now that you've done that, again, let's pick out the components. So if you identified the theme of madness as the how, then you are absolutely correct. This is the theme. Often literary studies, it's a theme, a motif, a type of imagery, maybe it's a tone that's taken, but again, it's something that focuses on the close reading. In terms of other kinds of studies, it could be your point of entry, your lens, your theoretical lens, or some sort of data set that you grab to indicate something. Okay, so then you move on to the what. And so if you identify the fact that Gilman takes a feminist approach in the yellow wallpaper, now notice that the yellow wallpaper, which is a short story, is in quotation marks, which is absolutely appropriate. Short stories are in quotation marks, novels are in italics, article titles are typically in quotation marks, so you want to know when to use italics or underlines and when to use quotation marks. So this also, in terms of the argument, talks about how the feminist approach portrays the social limitations of Victorian women in the text. So you're like, okay, this is really succinct. I get what's going on here. So then let's, of course, move to the why. Why is it significant? Well, this is significant because the author highlights the unbeknownst struggle of women by using terror and madness to problematize social and political constraints of women during the late 19th century. And this could be the unbeknownst struggle of the primary protagonist, or the struggles here. You can add a S, it's a little bit off in that sense. But you have this really great, succinct thesis statement. And all of these thesis statements are by former students who did receive A's, but of course there are some things that you can tweak. Like here, I would probably change a little bit about the unbeknownst struggles of women or something along those lines. Okay. So moving on to our last example, and this kind of breaks the mold of literary study in case you're trying to adapt this to other papers, other kinds of areas, especially on our campus, and thinking about the social sciences, even the sciences. Everybody has their own kind of format, so adhere to those formats, but this is where you can see the what, how, why impacting what's going on in all of these and how to organize all of your papers. It can certainly be a thread that organizes your writing from this point forward. So again, I would pause the slideshow and think about the way in which this thesis statement example breaks down, and then we'll discuss it in just a few moments. So, thesis statement example 3. If we're thinking about the following by analyzing statistics reporting student success and graduation rates from the 2011-2012 school year, okay? So this is our methodology. These are the stats. This is what we're using. Then we move on to say one can see the effects of racism and classism negatively impacting graduation rates in Clark County. So we know that we're looking at the 2011-2012 school year. We know that we're looking at success and graduation rates of students. We know that we're looking at Clark County. It doesn't mention that this is high school, but it is looking at high school, so we know that this is something local. Now notice the word effects. Effects is a neutral word, and so are they positive effects? Are they negative effects? You usually need a qualifier. Here, since it says effects of racism and classism negatively impact, we get the sense that this is not a good thing. Impact is also a neutral word, so you do need some sort of qualification in front of it. And here we have negatively, right? So it's negatively impacting graduation rates. And finally, in terms of the what, of course, there it is. And then in terms of the how, we have the major gaps, right? So this is significant because major gaps between classes, and they mean social classes, detrimentally impact the graduation rates of Clark County schools, since lower funding rates equals less students graduating from each school. So it's important to think about in those terms as you're stacking up the what, how, and why. And you'll see here that in all of these three examples, the how came first because sometimes it's more efficient to get out of the way. Like, I'm using this method of evaluation in order to prove the following. You could say in order to prove the following, this method of evaluation is employed, but then it ends up almost being used again to go right back to the what in order to prove the following, right? So you might want to think about splitting up the parameters of your argument if you want to talk about the what, how, the what, or you could talk about it as the how and then leading into the what. You can reorder the how and the what however you like in the first sentence, but the second sentence is always the why and focusing on that. It can touch on the what and the how, but it is focusing on the why. Why does it matter? Again, the why is what's left out of student papers quite often. So I hope that you've enjoyed the slideshow, or at least that it's giving you something to think about and something to work with in starting your papers. Again, to recap, the thesis statement comes at the end of your introduction. It's the last two sentences. And I really feel like this is a thesis statement model that you can adapt and use in every class and every paper going forward. So on that note, happy writing.